baseball sucks because I don't like mom yelling at me from the stands, or dad going like, just throw a strike. Like, I promise you, that little boy or girl on the mound, with every fiber of their being, wants to throw a strike.
Welcome everybody to episode 23 of ITTV. So my name is Scott Hassey. I am the pitching coordinator and I'm a board member with the Indiana Twins. And we've got this show going. We're 23 episodes in. I'm excited to have Deven Morgan on from Driveline Baseball, who's going to bring a lot to the table that I think is slightly different than what we've had in the past. I just think people will be able to relate with Deven because he's a dad. I mean, you see him on Twitter, you see him wherever it is, and he's a dad first. And then he's a nut, as he'll probably say multiple times, about baseball, which is fantastic.
That's fair.
So with that said, just real quick, if you want to watch a replay of this and you're curious what we're talking about, I will upload by the end of the week this up to YouTube. And then under the show more in the comments section down there, I'll kind of timestamp everything. So the topics that we talk about, so you can kind of skip around. If you've got any questions or you want to follow us anywhere on social media, it's just at Indiana Twins across the board, youtube.com/Indiana Twins. All pretty simple. And then indianatwins@gmail.com. That'll typically be me answering those questions. So we will, without further ado, jump right in. And Deven, I'm going to have you, I don't want to do a traditional introduce your bio because you know what, people can read it on the Facebook post or Instagram post or something like that. But what
Sure.
I want to go into, I just want to jump right in with, because on Driveline Plus, I've seen a lot of your good ideas. What do you think is one of the most unique ideas that you've either taken from somewhere else or heard or thought of as far as like either practice planning or drills or something at the youth level? Because I've got one on the top of my head or a couple ideas, but I'm curious.
I think the thing that people are surprised by the most is my appreciation for a bad swing. And what I mean by that is a swing that doesn't achieve the desired output. Like, desired output is obviously it starts with bad on ball contact. I mean, that's just kind of like the primary thing. That's the building block of like the desired intention, right? It starts with round ball, round bat. When it comes to youth training, I am very much of the mind that like we don't learn how to sprint by jogging, which is to say that like when it comes to youth baseball, I don't care if we win or lose. Me personally, I am 100% that psychopath in my own competitive life where like I just want to win and I have no tolerance for anything other than that. But the way that I try to instruct and teach and the way that I generally try to do a good job of helping my own kids have context is like none of this matters. You know, like you can pick a guy, Corbin, Mike Fox, and pick a high level, Power 5 NCAA coach in baseball. For an average 9 to 15-year-old, maybe 14, like I'll reel it in a little bit. If that kid goes out and they go 0 for 4 or 4 for 4 on any given weekend, neither one of these people at the next level, they don't care. And then if you go 0 for 4, they also don't care. So for me, when it comes to my perspective about youth baseball and a weird thing that I think people are taken aback by sometimes, and it's like, I want to encourage these kids to find the ultimate threshold of how fast they can move. I want to see how big we can make our intention and then have our actions follow it. And what I've seen at the ground level is that oftentimes when you try to put kids in that environment, they will stumble sometimes. They're gonna have that swing where it's like they proverbially swing out of their shoes. And when that happens, and the kid falls down and they lose their balance, I'm the weirdo on the sideline that's like, clap, 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 good swing. Because what I believe is that over time, that kid is going to learn how to control that speed. But they have to get familiar with it, right? And even if in a training environment, we want to get to a point where we're able to go to 100% capacity. We want to do that safely. Naturally, when kids get in a competition environment, they tend to be driven by just the first principle nature of the environment, which is like winning makes me feel good and losing makes me feel bad. and I don't want to lose. So even if they down-regulate, right, and because they're in competition and they want to do well, and they go from 100%, where it's like we're possibly on the ragged edge of control, and they go down to 95%, if over the course of training, we've turned that 100-mile-an-hour swing from, say, a 40-mile-an-hour bat speed to a 50-mile-an-hour bat speed, if we take 5% off the table, we're still higher than we were, which, as it pertains to competition, the harder we hit the ball, the more likely we have positive outcomes. The harder we swing the bat, the more likely we hit the ball hard. So when it comes to training, I am that guy that's like, I mean, you can see on my Twitter, you know, there's videos of my kids where it's like they're swinging so hard that they do swing out of their shoes. And I try to make a point of when that happens being like, good swing. I want to emphasize that, in part because I want to send the signal relative to like our perspective about training and long-term development. As their father, I also want to send the signal that like, I'm here. My love and appreciation for what you're doing is not predicated on your outcome. It's predicated on your output. So it's, you know, it's that whole train of thought, which I could probably go on for another 20 minutes on, but I won't. Yeah.
No,
yeah.
actually,
Maybe we'll get there.
It reminded me, for whatever reason, I haven't thought of this in I don't know how many years, but in 6th grade, we had a track race. No one had ever like raced competitively. We didn't have a team. It was 6th grade. It was end of elementary. It wasn't middle school for us. We had elementary and junior high. And we had a girl who was one of the fastest 3 girls. And at 12 years old, the girls are faster than most of the boys.
Sure.
So she crushed me. But it was funny because when she would race, we all went out to the track, and there's like hundreds of kids because like every school's kids. And she goes out there head down, and she had to run through 3 different lanes, but she still, even if she would have ran straight, she just crushed everyone.
Yeah.
So if someone were, obviously with baseball, there's a correlation here, but if someone would have told her before she went out to sprint, like, hey, here's sprint form, and she would have had head up, maybe she would have been focusing on things, she might not have won those races. But man, when you said just go run, she crushed everybody. So are you getting kids that, let's say, I feel like at 12 is a good age, again, that where they start to kind of think that they're a little bit too cool, or they're trying to be cool, and you have them swing out of their shoes? Because I imagine an 8-year-old loves swinging out of their shoes.
Sure.
A 12-year-old, does it take them a couple swings or a couple practices of doing that where they're like, okay, this is not bad?
I think, yeah, I mean, you got to send that signal, right? And especially with that 12-year-old, you know, if they've been playing baseball since they're, you know, 4, 5, 6 years old, you might have to break down a lot of previous signal that little boy or girl has been given by other people. And especially for me as like a rec baseball coach, if the signal that I have to break down is coming from that little boy or girl's, their mom and dad, that's a really significant signal. And, you know, obviously it's good eventually for us to be able to kind of talk to our parents and try to get on the same page about a lot of this type of stuff. But I think it's not so much the too cool thing. It's just like they need to be given permission and freedom to fail a little bit. And it's not to say that like I'm trying to coach kids to like never hit the ball. You know, like baseball is still just kind of like it's an action and output based game. And at the youth level, if you create action more often than not, typically you're going to win a lot of games, especially at the rec level, right? And there's more kids that play rec ball than there is anything else. So there's a large percentage of kids who the environment of youth baseball, playing on a 60-foot field, 46-foot or 50-foot, you know, pitching distance, depending whether you're little league or pony, they're coming up in a competition environment where, because of a bunch of different environmental factors, if you just have a high, so we'll take this from like the hitting side of things. If you have a high quantity of contact, which is to say we're just putting the ball in play a lot, that tends to work. My concern has always been like, I'm not too worried about what happens between the ages of like 12 or 13 and under. I really start to think about where we set these kids up for success from like 12 and 13 over. Because oftentimes, you know, you take that kid who has had success with that type of high quantity of contact approach as opposed to a high quality of contact approach, and you put him in a high school baseball game, and all of a sudden, you know, that ball that you thought that was just going to like get through the 5-6 hole, that's an out. because the kids that are playing shortstop and third base now, they're way better. You're in a way bigger field, but your previous years of experience, and those years could be 2 years or 6 years or 8 years, depending on when a kid started to play the game, have all kind of sent that signal to you as a competitor that like that thing kind of plays. But then there's this whole other thing in 90-foot baseball, and it's not the same. It's staggeringly different. So it's not that like we're constantly telling kids like, hey, don't worry about actually making contact with the ball. A lot of times what we think about is kind of environments and scaling. You know, the environment is the one that's going to send the signal to those kids that it's like, it's okay to move fast. You know, and sometimes, you know, you're going to find some warts that happen along with that. But like over the long term, I'm okay with that because I feel confident that you're going to learn how to control it. And then two, it's just kind of having them understand that like we're orienting towards the thing that's going to matter the most long term, rather than trying to like satiate your needs for today. And we got to leave them breadcrumbs. Like we got to make them feel good along the way. We have to have them be positively, emotionally engaged with the game of baseball, because for kids nowadays, if that's not a thing, why would you play? You know, with all the other options these kids have, before you even get in the consideration of like what it's meant to a lot of these kids to be sheltered in place for like the last 3 or 4 months, they have a lot of other options. So what we do is, you know, if we can land on the environmental side of things and make kids feel supported and encouraged, either succeed or fail, even though we are always constantly, I mean, we're aiming to win, right? That is the intention, and I'm not going to lie to a kid about that. But if we take care of that environment, then I can start to think about things like how do I scale, right? So it could be that in order to help a kid just get permission to move fast, we got to scale all the way down to the tee, or we got to scale all the way down to something like side soft toss or front flips and really, really easy competition environment. But then when we start to get a little bit of intention and output in that environment, then we're constantly thinking about scaling outwards. Which is why, you know, it's hard to do that type of stuff when you don't have a lot of practice time. So specific to youth baseball, and kind of the way that travel ball specifically has kind of pushed itself over the course of the last maybe 5 years. If you play so many games and you don't have time for practices, then you're constantly competition oriented, right? The organization is, the coaches are, and the kids are, because winning makes me feel good and losing makes me feel bad. So when it comes to something like I'll kind of point to the thing above my head, like our Driveline Academy youth teams, we're probably going to play 30 games, maybe ish, because I want to help these kids scratch that itch for competition, right? They want to get between the lines. They want to see how the thing that they're working on in the facility or out on the practice field translates to game competition. But I need time, you know, I need workload that I can spend in the gym, actually building those motors, building, you know, fundamental athletics, and then starting to figure out how we deploy that in a scalable environment specific to throwing the ball and hitting the ball. So we're constantly thinking about those two things, environments and scaling.
I might know what your answer is, but I'm curious. So for those of you that don't know, Deven, a few years ago, was not with Driveline, took his son out there because he bought into the approach of the data-driven approach. And then fast forward, got a job, kind of working out entry level, worked his way up. And now all of a sudden, you went from watching from the sidelines, and I'm sure you had some great ideas, and you also loved it because there was exposure for your son to see success at the highest level with guys coming in there. And now all of a sudden, you're kind of the guy as a director of youth baseball development that you get to implement some of your own ideas now. What's been kind of one of the most exciting things that you've gotten to do, whether it's certification or the academy or anything else?
You know, it's been a progression. And really, like, I benefit so much from being surrounded by a ton of guys and girls at the company that I've gotten to learn from. And like, I can listen to and get their ideas and their opinions and their perspective on like what helps elite level baseball players, and then try to distill that into like what's applicable for kids. You know, I think the youth baseball development certification was like the first the first kind of shot across the bow, and it's been really positively received, which it still kind of blows me away. We've gone well past the 500 user mark. We're quickly, well, no, we're actually well over 600 now, because we just locked down a pretty big deal with, I think this is out in the public, with Baseball Australia. So we had a bunch of Australian baseball coaches at the youth level that are going to go through this course. And like, I thought it would be good. Like I thought it would be good, and I put enough time into it to feel reasonably confident that it would be good. But it's been pretty cool to kind of see that product kind of take off, just because I tried to do the best job that I can to connect kind of these two things, as like the developmental paradigm, right? But in a framework that's applicable for your average, 8 to 9 to 13 or 14-year-old little boy or girl, because they're different. Working with kids is not the same as working with professional athletes. So being able to marry those two things in the youth baseball dev cert was huge. But right now, Driveline Academy is it's the thing that I spend every waking moment kind of thinking about and working on, because we're really trying to be a little bit disruptive towards what is kind of tolerated as normal by a lot of kind of the travel ball select baseball ecosystem, because a lot of guys aren't like you guys in terms of the way that you make considerations kind of for like respecting the customer. And the customer is, again, it's a little kid that like has this impulse that like they love the game. And we want to honor that as best we can. But we also want to be mindful of like developing them for long term, because that's the thing that we want to. I went to a conference in Detroit last October, put on by the Aspen Institute and their initiative called Project Play. And one of the things that they kept saying over and over and over in this conference was like, there aren't enough free play opportunities for kids. These kids are not broadly getting enough exposure to athletics in general. And of course, I see this through the lens of baseball. And they started talking about a lot of the problems with the cost, and cost being the significant barrier towards kids getting access to the game. And like, that's just, from my perspective, that's just not sustainable. We can't make high quality baseball training and baseball education for coaches as well. It can't simply be the single domain of like one specific socioeconomic class in this country. That doesn't work. So since then, and certainly before that, but I think that really kind of put the battery in my back to think about like, how do we work towards equity of access and information specific to youth baseball. We know and kind of tolerate that like we lose somewhere between like 60 or 70% of the kids between the ages of 12 and 14, right? It's that gap from 60 to 90 foot. And probably I think within my first 6 months at Driveline, I did a presentation to the whole company and was like, this sucks and I don't want to tolerate it. Because if we lose, say we lose 60%, right? If we change that number from 60% to say 55% or 50%, if you have 10 more percent of the nation's younger kids that actually want to play high school baseball, that's transformative. Like you're not just having these high school programs that just run one team, right? There's more competition. There's more players playing, and we get these kids still in the game as they go through puberty. And that's the thing that, one of the things that we really wanted to kind of disrupt about this kind of overly serious, overly outcome-based perspective about youth baseball is that if we put these kids through this kind of emotional ringer, before you even get into the issue with like the overall volume of games that they're playing, but you put them through the emotional ringer of kind of what a lot of youth baseball has become, we run the risk of having these kids not having broadly the emotional maturity to navigate those waters, right? And especially so if they have a coach or even a parent who buys into that perspective. And then we lose these games before puberty. We lose them to the game before the peak height velocity years, right? And that's the period of time where it's like you really get a sense of like where the athlete is going to be. And we lose them. We lose them way before that because they're like 11 years old and they're like, baseball sucks because I don't like mom yelling at me from the stands, or dad going like, just throw a strike. Like, I promise you, that little boy or girl on the mound, with every fiber of their being, wants to throw a strike. They want to make contact when they swing. Their desire and their clarity of desire could not be any more dialed in. But they're kids. They're still learning how to move their bodies. Like, you don't see a lot of high school kids, when they go out to their cars to go buy lunch, trip and fall in the parking lot, right? Because they're high schoolers. Go to an elementary school. Watch the recess. Like, don't watch recess like a creep, but like watch recess. These kids, they're kids and they're figuring their bodies out. And it's like, sometimes they'll be highly coordinated and then they'll grow 2 inches in 6 months and then they can't move. So it's just overall, it's trying to construct a relationship with these kids where it's like they feel supported and encouraged to maintain the initial impulse that they had, which is they want to play baseball. I don't know what that is. I don't know what it is or where it starts, if it's nature or nurture. When you have these kids, it's like they watch their mom or dad play, or they watch an older sibling play, or they watch somebody in MLB play, and they're like, I want to do that thing. I don't know how that happens, but when that kid has that impulse, I want to pour gasoline on that thing and like, let's burn that fire brighter. And putting kids in, data-driven environments where their output is validated, where their hard work is validated, where they're emotionally supported, I think makes it more likely that we keep them in the game longer. The other thing where it's like, we treat any given youth baseball tournament with the seriousness of the baton death march. That's not likely to keep that kid around for long. And it's like, it's great when they win. If you're winning, that works. But this is baseball, and baseball will punch you in the stomach if you stay around long enough. And the reason that people like you and I love this game is because it's a conduit for teaching people how to deal with that stuff. It's a conduit for teaching you how to be a functional adult and human being and work through adversity. But if we lose kids before they have the emotional maturity to see the benefit of seeing it through, they never get that lesson. And it's like, we're doing this, the Driveline Academy. We're going to have youth teams finally. People can no longer chirp at us from the sidelines and go, well, you guys never have a team. You're never between the lines. That's not going to be a thing anymore when we have youth teams, when we have high school teams, we have a collegiate summer team. But you're going to see the way that we approach this is not that like, I'm sending the signal to any of our athletes that like, this is a live or die thing, because it's not. It's youth baseball. And all these kids aren't going to go play in the show. That's just not going to be a thing. All of them are very likely not going to go play D1 baseball. I'd love to open the doors of opportunity for them to be able to play some type of higher level 90-foot baseball. But no matter what, if these kids connect to the idea that like, I worked really hard at something and I know that I got better in an unquestionable sense, they're making that connection that hard work is good. Like that's a very powerful signal for any young boy or girl to learn. I wish I did a better job of knowing that when I was in my 20s. So that I can't even remember why we started talking about this point, but like, yeah, that's it.
Well, it was basically opening up the door for what you're fired up for with kind of taking over. I do want to, before I kind of move on to some of the other topics, I want to dive a little bit deeper, and I hope this isn't too open-ended. I don't want to make for it to be a long answer, so I'll try to be as specific as possible. But because one of the things that we work towards every year is to get adequate coaching. There's obviously going to be limited, and there's not always every dad and every player wants to come back and coach. So sometimes you have what you have, but we do a really good job, I think, of trying to kind of screen the coaches, have a conversation with them, talk baseball shop, see what their background is, see if they buy into what we do. Mm-hmm. So have you guys kind of thought through that? What are some of the things you're going to be looking for? Because that can be a huge task.
For us, it's hard to say this without sounding like I have an ego about it. I feel fairly confident that the youth baseball development certification is going to scratch a lot of that in terms of helping our coaches understand our general perspective and the intention. We're making some other considerations around just kind of more social emotional learning, especially with the younger kids. And then we're also doing things like MLB has a pure baseball compliant program where it's like they kind of go through and literally like screen adults for some of the bad behavior that we just kind of don't want. So, ideally, I feel really confident that our certification stack can kind of take care of the technical side of things, and also kind of the set the floor for kind of intention and language, like you talked about. So because we already have that, it's just kind of leaning more into the social emotional side of things and making sure that is given a lot of consideration. And the great thing is that it's like, our staff, other than me, is mostly comprised of guys and girls that played high level athletics. And the great thing about that is that I can say fairly confidently that kind of across the board, because they have higher level experience, they understand the way that the perspective should shift appropriately for youth baseball. Because if you've played, you've gone into like an indie ball tryout, and you put 6 months or 9 months or 12 months or 18 months or 24 months of your life into one thing to show up to an indie ball tryout because you want to continue to scratch and fight and claw your way back into affiliated baseball, what that struggle's like. So it's like, if I'm like, hey, we're going to work with some 9 to 13-year-olds, and we're just going to try to hit the ball hard and throw the ball far, they're like, their perspective on that is pretty dialed, fortunately. But yeah, that's our stack.
So is it going to be staff that you have plus some dads from outside, or what's the staffing going to look like?
I think we want to err away from any like officially designated coach or head coach be a parent. Because that includes me, because oftentimes that's where things can get a little bit problematic. So I feel pretty confident that if the coach or the assistant coach is either an employee of ours, a longtime employee of ours, or if it's like, a guy or a girl that we have that's training with us, say on a gap year, they're going to be with us for 9 to 12 months. It's a good way for us to be able to give a little bit of extra income to that athlete that's already working with us. They understand our stuff. And we already, we're in a good position to be able to feel confident that they're going to get good outcomes and good experiences for their kids.
Well, that's fantastic that you guys kind of have that in-house plus kind of the inventory of people returning. We're kind of starting to hit our stride with the sweet spot of guys that are coming back and helping out. And it's super helpful. All right, let's get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts. So from a strength perspective, for you guys, you're lucky enough to have an awesome team. You've got strength guys, you got PT guys, you got yourself, you got form players. So from a strength side, what are one or two of the big areas that you're seeing that you're able to make some big strides with players in their development at the youth level?
The thing is for younger kids is we can gain so much by executing some real meat and potato stuff. Because the truth of the matter is, and then if you're a parent that has kids, the curriculum that they get in their PE class is very different than what it was. I remember the sit-up competitions, and sit-ups are kind of eyewash, but whatever. I mean, I remember that, right? I remember the presidential fitness test. I remember the push-up test. I remember the rope climb. I remember the pull-up challenge or whatever. I'm the worst at pull-ups. I have a genetic disposition to be terrible at pull-ups. But I remember all that stuff, right? The programming that the kids get at least in my two kids' couple different schools is very much kind of, what's the way to say this? It's more kind of like movement based. I suspect it's kind of a reaction to the fact that a lot of kids are more sedentary. So because of that, they're trying to just get them to get up and move. So they create a bunch of kind of different games and just get them moving. And not to say that any of that's bad, but if you can look on YouTube, and this stuff is hilarious. You can find footage from 50s and 60s gym classes. And it's mostly all guys because, okay, it's the 50s and 60s, so we'll give that kind of disclaimer in terms of equity. However, all these guys are ripped. Like they're all yoked, and they're just knocking out push-ups and they're pull-ups, and they're like climbing over walls, and they're doing air squats, and like that was what they did in gym class a long time ago. They don't get that nowadays. So for a lot of these kids, it starts with just like meat and potatoes stuff. In a technical sense, we're constantly looking for force production and force acceptance. That is kind of the hallmark of what we're trying to do. Can you produce force in the transverse plane and the sagittal plane, but like a lot of this stuff, if I have a kid doing single arm dumbbell rows, if I had kids doing just push-ups, just body weight push-ups, air squats, kettlebell squats, goblet squats, kettlebell lunges, like it doesn't need to be super exotic, and they can still get not only a ton of growth out of it, but a ton of benefit towards performance. So that's typically what we try to do is kind of establish just kind of some floor of movement competency, and make sure we feel really confident about checking those boxes before we get into anything exotic. My kids in our youth long-term training at Driveline from October through February of last year, leading into was supposed to lead into our season this year. A lot of what they did was just kind of fundamental movement. You got to create force, and you got to be able to accept force, and you can get a little bit more kind of creative about the way that you train for that stuff. You can, jump off of a box and land on one leg. You can do, sprinter, one leg jumps, right? There's all this type of stuff that you can do when it's like, and the kids, they just think it's play. Really what we're trying to do is we're trying to set the floor. So it's like, yeah, I want to be able to get you under a barbell at some point. I want to be able to turn that air squat into a kettlebell squat, but we need to do that. We're going to do that at the point that I feel really confident that you can execute both of those things correctly. You are able to like hip hinge. You're able to kind of stabilize your core and your torso as you hit your push up. The butt's not getting up in the air, nor is it kind of like the tummy sinking in. So just establishing like some fundamental movement competence in very, very simple terms. Push, pull, right? Like really, really simple terms. Upper body and lower body is from what I've seen is just hugely impactful for kids, because a lot of times they're just not getting it other places.
Your daughter plays ball, right?
Yep. She's a baseball player. She had a couple years that I lost her to fast pitch. And after some not good experiences, I put the bug in her ear and I was like, come back and play for dad. And fortunately, she was able to, she worked her tail off, and she had 2 really good baseball seasons. Made the MLB Trailblazer program that was supposed to be this year for 96 girls in the country to go down to LA and be at the MLB Elite Development Camp. Of course, that got postponed, unfortunately, but she'll be on one of our Driveline Academy teams playing hardball.
That's awesome. So I asked that because I know your son does, and I've seen them both swinging, so I didn't know what capacity. So one of the things that we try to educate our parents on, that we've done a poor job traditionally, because it used to be we would complain, but then we just need to look in the mirror and realize it was our issue, that we need to educate the parents. If they are seeing that they get, with what we offer, they get pitching, they get hitting, they get performance training, a lot of the things you're talking about with the movements and the exercises, they get a ton of other things. They're going to go pitching and hitting, and then, hey, I can't make it to performance training, or PT we call it. Or they just kind of prioritize it in that order because it seems more traditional. So you've got an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old that I'm sure have seen large gains in their performance and their output and a bunch of other things. What would you tell another parent, so parent to parent, that is saying, I've got these 3 things, and my son's going to go to hitting and pitching and PT, and they say it's important, but I really want to go to pitching, or I really want to go to hitting?
I would say listen to the signal that like the big boys in the room are sending. You listen to a guy like Eric Bakich, head coach of UMichigan. Sorry. You listen to Bakich talk, and he's like, I need athletes. I need athletes. You listen to a good high school baseball coach, when they start talking about the qualities of what they're looking for with incoming freshmen, it's almost the exact same thing. because both of those people, a good high school baseball coach and a good college coach, they know that they have, high school, I mean, you have 4 years. A college coach, maybe you have 2, 3, okay, sometimes 4, but you have 4 years to to refine things. The example that I constantly give is, it's like there's 2 versions of the problem you can present to a high school baseball coach. A kid that has a high degree of baseball skill refinement, but is lacking in motor output, or a kid that has above grade motor output and needs some skill refinement. If that's a youth kid and you present that problem to a good high school baseball coach, the good coach is going to go, it's an easy choice. I need the motor output kid, because the motor output kid, I have 4 years to solve that problem. I have 4 years to refine the way that they deploy the thing that they're good at within the scope of this game that we call baseball. And they're going to get stronger even from that point, right? It's not like you're going to get to 14 and you're going to plateau. That's 14 is when we start to make real gains. So that's one problem. The other problem, that kid has a high degree of baseball skill refinement. So these kids where it's like they're constantly at pitching lessons and they're constantly getting talked to, and they have voices about like all these different mechanical checkpoints. And you can see the same thing on the hitting side. Those kids tend to be very refined, but simply due to the fact that all of us, we don't have enough time. I don't even hardly have enough time to train my own 2 kids, much less, the kids that I see like in a rec environment where it's like I see them 3 times a week. It's a question of time. And if you put all your time and all your chips on this side in terms of skill refinement, it's directly taking away the time that you had to develop skill output. And skill output can be, developed on a baseball field or in a training session with, plyo balls, weighted bats, that type of stuff. And it also can be developed by giving literally like 15 minutes at the end of your practice. We're going to do a squat, push-up, plank contests, and they can benefit from that. And there's direct correlation to the way that they develop those capabilities in terms of their performance. We've knocked down that wall about like kids in strength training a long time ago. It's not going to hurt their growth plates. It's safe to do. Kids, the study that everybody always brings up is like kids, I think the experience was like a 25 or a 50% increase in strength over the course of like a 12-week program that was just simple stuff. And the reason for that is not because they stack on a bunch of muscle, because they're genetically not disposed to do that. What they do is they learn a higher degree of neuromuscular control. They learn how to control their bodies. They learn how to control and emphasize the force that they're actually capable of producing. So it's like, again, on the throwing side, I always try to tell my kids, it's like, look, I don't want you to throw a strike. I want you to throw a competitive pitch, because if you throw a competitive pitch with intent, you're taking away time that hitter has to make a decision. And that is the best thing that you can do. You take away their decision-making time. You keep them on their heels and you attack them. We can do that by throwing with intent on Tuesday's training session, and on Wednesday's training session. If we get stronger, then I want to deploy both of those things on Saturday's game. It's got to be a holistic part of the puzzle. There's guys like, Mark Ripito in his book, Starting Strength, he actually advocates for kids around the age of 14. So again, when puberty starts, to literally like take away a secondary sport and get 6 months under a barbell. For me, with my kids, I have a 13 and 11. We, over the course of the last 3 years, have established some movement competence. So now we're starting to get under a barbell because we're not doing it in a way that we're just like chasing 1 rep maxes. We're not training into hypertrophy. We are just establishing movement competence with a little bit more load in a new environment. So again, it's like, if you're trying to get strong, it helps to have both protein and carbohydrates and fruits and veggies. Like, you just got to touch it all, right? Like, you want balance in all things. And, for those kids where it's just like they're constantly at the pitching session and they avoid the strength stuff, it's like you're literally installing a ceiling on how high you're going to be able to perform, because you're nailing the technique thing, and you're underemphasizing the motor output thing. And they have to, they're very much, they should be paired.
said a couple things that I think might be glossed over, so I want you to dive a little bit deeper. You mentioned a 12-week program, and I don't think I've actually seen that study and the effects that it had. You mentioned that your kids have been doing movement, competency things and skills, and building foundation for 3 years. I think, and it's not the fault of the parent, it's definitely not the fault of the uneducated child or youth player, but a lot of parents like me or that are older than me, I'm in my 30s. When I played in high school and in college, I had no strength and conditioning coach. I was trying to figure out how to exercise out of a Men's Health magazine.
Yep.
And there's a different magazine every month if you're not familiar. So I'm doing workouts different every month. So it's easy for us to tell them, and they're like, oh yeah, I should get stronger. But both parents, and sometimes even our coaches that have played at a high level, and definitely our athletes, don't realize the long-term, not only effect, but the grueling process sometimes, what the expectation is. Can you talk a little bit more about putting in the time?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about kids is that they're highly adaptable I think at a bunch of different levels. Kids are pretty adaptable. Specific to strength training, they tend to see fairly quick and significant gains if they're just consistent. So for my kids, it started with just like, we just gotta hit some push-ups, and like mom and dad were doing push-ups in the living room, on the living room carpet, and we tried to set a good example. And fortunately some of that stuff landed. And then, it's you get one kettlebell, and then you get two, and then you have like 5 of them, and you get the Iron Man kettlebell and the Gorilla kettlebell, or whatever, how exotic you want to go. But it's like, as parents, if we live a lifestyle that's like very sedentary, it's not necessarily sending a great signal to the kid that like athletics and physical health is important. My kids, when this whole shelter in place thing started, I was very concerned that I wasn't going to be able to lift for like 3 months, and lifting is part of how I maintain my sanity. So I got a cheap rack, Driveline was shut down, brought, 500 pounds worth of weight home, and like got after it. And so I think my kids have been fortunate that they've seen, myself and my wife, doing some of this stuff. I mean, it's something we participate in as a family. Like tonight, I had to run my weights back to Driveline because we're getting ready to open the facility. So tonight is going to be like a body weight and kettlebell exercise, and it's family workout time. And we'll probably do that while we watch The Office or something. Like, it's part of the way that we spend time together, but it's also, I believe, really important that we continue to send that signal to our kids that it's like health and wellness is a thing. It's something you can be mindful of, and it's something you can devote like kind of a fractional amount of time in your day towards to get a lot of significant benefits beyond like the physical stuff. I mean, you're talking about dopamine and endorphin release, and like, especially for kids who are dealing with this unprecedented pandemic that none of us saw coming. That's a good thing. I love the clarity that I feel after I, hit a deadlift or a bench session. I want my kids to be able to have access to that same thing. They're not going to load 500 pounds up on the bar, but like, they go through and it's just like, it's meat and potato stuff. It's push-ups, planks, or dead bugs, what we call them, squats, single arm dumbbell rows. Like, it's not exotic, but it's just meat and potato stuff, and I think it's really beneficial.
All right, I want to pick your brain as a coach, so put on your coach's hat. And so we had our kind of opening weekend for a lot of our teams, and players are going to struggle week one, whether it's because it's week one, whether it's because of the pandemic. But forever and ever in baseball, that first week there's going to be struggle. And honestly, the entire season, most coaches will take down notes on things that they struggled with. Some do, some don't. But how do you as a coach take the struggles from the weekend and then orient the practice during the week to kind of fill those holes or educate the players or work on things?
I think it starts with like, very often when I first started coaching kids, they go into competition. You work on this stuff in practice, and you go into competition, and like there's a very, very significant gap between those two things. And I think as a younger coach, I would just be like, what's wrong with these kids, man? We practice that. Like, I know we practiced that, right? And it's like, because I had my practice plan and I checked all these little boxes, and it's like, and then they didn't do it in the game. Well, how come? Well, again, some of that is just because they're kids, and kids are not small adults. They're kids. But then past that, I think if I've done anything right over the course of the last couple of years, it's realized that like their failings are broadly my failings. So last year's season, right? We were talking before this thing kind of started about the weather in the Northwest. Last year, our winter was so bad, our assessments got pushed back by 2 weeks, and we only had like, I only had, I think, like 5 practices with my team before we ended up having to start our season, because we don't start our season in time, then we don't have enough time to get in games before All-Stars, et cetera, et cetera. And because we had such a small amount of time, and I'm like the driveline guy, I'm like, all right, we're going to lean a lot more towards the kind of stuff that matters most, right? We got to be able to throw, we got to be able to hit, and I know that I don't have a lot of time on the defensive side. And specifically how that showed up is over the course of like the first like 3 weeks of our games, I can't tell you how many times we got burned on a soft ground ball between the first baseman and the second baseman. Over and over and over and over and over. And as a guy that, like, you know, I played baseball as a kid, I know who's supposed to be doing what in that play, right? You could wake me up at 3 o'clock in the morning and be like, you're the second baseman, ground ball shaded to second, first base is coming off the bag. What are you supposed to do? Like, I got it. I'm a 43-year-old man. These are like 10 to 12-year-old kids. And if they're struggling at that, specifically in a competition environment, it's really related to 2 things. One, I either haven't taught them, or 2, they're seeing a decay in their ability to execute what I've been taught them, because our training level of competition and consequence wasn't high enough. You know, they're unfamiliar with the consequence of competition because we haven't practiced with anything on the line. So, you know, a lot of times, especially on the defensive side of things, when you do your drill work and stuff like that, it's very easy to just be like, there's no context and there's no stakes. There's no game being played. We're just getting reps. But getting reps is very different than 2 outs, bottom of 5, first and third, ground ball to second base. What do you do? It's entirely different in terms of the emotional and the competition context. So what I tried to do was like, okay, they're failing because of me. And I knew that like we just didn't have enough time. You know, we got constricted by weather and stuff. So instead of doing like, you know, what we started doing in our pregame infield, instead of doing like any outie and kind of typical stuff or whatever, is we would just practice the situations that I knew that we didn't have enough time to do it. And I would try to call out a situation, you know, so it's like, all right, we got 1 out, boo, boo, boo. Everybody know their job. Okay, now let's try to do it. I got like a 10-second window to maybe offer something corrective. And then it's like, we got to go in. Okay, new situation. Now we got runners at second and third. We got 1 out. What are we going to do? Like, you got to pressure test that stuff. So for me, it kind of comes back to like, yeah, the first thing is like top level, identify the situation that we're failing in, but then 2, try to come back to those 2 questions. Like, did I just not teach them? I mean, did we literally not cover this? But if we did I do it a way where it's like the emotional and competition context mirrored what we're going to see in a game? And if one of those 2 things are lacking, well, it's like, of course, you know, they're kids, so like default to that. But then B, of course, they're going to struggle because we just didn't touch it. And we didn't touch it in a way that actually resembled what it's going to look like in competition.
That's perfect. That made me think of just some other fun things. I think one of the most fun things about being around baseball and getting to coach, aside from fungo golf, is that you can create little fun games and you can gamify things. You start talking about that competition. What's one of the more fun ways that you can gamify a practice, a drill, a situation, whatever it is?
I try to gamify everything. And I come up with like stupid little names for it. Like, I mean, everything is a game. For the way that I try to run practices and also the way that we run stuff with our youth training at Driveline. We always want there to be stakes. And it kind of comes back to this thing that we talked about previously. Like, I know kids are first principle driven, right? They want to win because winning makes them feel good, losing makes them feel bad. They generally struggle to not define themselves by the outcomes of those activities because they don't do a great job of understanding abstract thought. At a cognitive level, that's something that kids aren't good at. But both of those things being true does not mean that I can't try to train that. The way that we train it is through gamification, where it's like there's constantly context in competition. And then whether you win that competition or lose that gamified contest, we're still going to move on to the next drill. Nobody's going to go home and be like, oh man, I feel so bad because, such and such having a game today. I'm trying to leave, again, like little breadcrumbs to be like, competition is good. I want you to want to win, but no matter what the outcome, we're okay. Like for these kids on my teams at the rec level, like, I love them either way. We're fine. So, years and years ago at the beginning of like hitting Twitter. So this is like Twitter, like 09, 2010. I saw the Great Wall of Ground Ball Prevention. It was an NAIA special where it was like, I can't remember if it was Herg, it was Travers or somebody else that basically just took a bunch of L screens and filled up the entire infield and creates this environment, a gamified environment where you hit the ball over that netting, that's good. You hit it under that netting, it doesn't go out of the infield, that's bad. And that was kind of the gamified way that he did that. I took that idea and was like, here's the deal, we're going to do that in Little League. And I'm going to grab a couple of my little bow nets, my sock nets or whatever, set them up around the infield, and we play a game called Don't Hurt the Puppies. And I'd say to my little, and then this was probably 4 years ago, when I first rolled this out in practice. Is I had the idea, but I didn't roll it out. So my son was probably like 7 or 8 or something like that, and be like, all right, you little 7 or 8-year-old boys, you guys, who's got a puppy at home? And they all raise their hands and like, I got a puppy. And it's like, what's your puppy's name? His name's Rocket. All right, I want you to imagine this infield is filled with puppies, and it's not only one Rocket, it's like all of Rocket's little brothers and sisters. And like, we love Rocket, right? Yeah, coach. Okay. You want to keep Rocket safe? You hit the ball in the grass. You don't have the ball touch the dirt. So we did a game called Don't Hurt the Puppies. And like, that was the gamified way of being able to teach them the thing that I value most as a coach, which is a hard hit ball in the air. And at a very basic level, I want them to kind of conceptualize that environment, attach some amount of like kind of positive output to like the ideal thing. But like, sometimes they're going to smoke a ground ball and it's like, they're going to go, oh no, Rocket. It's like, all right, well, next pitch, So yeah, gamification, man, and context is just huge.
Well, that's awesome. I heard when I was trying to do a little bit of homework beforehand, I heard you talk about that, and I'm glad you shared it because I forgot to bring it up. But that's a fantastic game. Okay, so the last thing I want to get into is our Twins critique session. I prepped you a little bit before this. We've been doing it with everyone we've had on. It's a chance where I get to ask the expert because we're always trying to evolve and learn as an organization, myself and our staff. So I preface it with basically what we are about. So the Indiana Twins is a travel baseball organization from 8U up through 17U. We have our college guys that come back and train with us periodically. And the two biggest things for us are, number one, we all speak the same language. So whether it's an 8-year-old parent or coach or player or an 18-year-old, they're all speaking the same language and the same kind of thing. And we even created our own in-house certification, much like you were talking about with your guys with youth baseball. That's helped us a ton. And then the other thing is that we're kind of a one-stop shop. So whether it's pitching, like I talked about, hitting and our performance training, we've also got mental training, all for 20 weeks. We've got an off-season training program, much like you guys are doing with the Academy. But we also offer some smaller camps, 4 to 6 weeks for outfield, infield, base running, catching, pretty much everything. So those are our two most important things. And like I said, we're always trying to learn from the experts, everyone all across the country, from Little League coaches to directors of youth development to professional coaches. So with all that said, is there anything that you're seeing at the youth level that you see coaches or organizations or teams struggling with, or anything that you could, or even with what we're saying that maybe you didn't hear that you're like, well, what about this?
If you want to like, pick anything in youth baseball that like is not being done well right now, it's kind of like it's fish in a barrel, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that like broadly, I think is just the incentive structure is wrong. We're incentivized to like have these teams end up on the 11U national leaderboard boop-de-boo thing. And we're parents, like we're parents, and at a very basic level, we come to this thing with good intentions. We want the best outcomes for our kids. We have these kids that have these crazy dreams of playing high-level baseball, and generally, like, it starts with the right thing. It starts with just like, I want to help my kid be the best that they can. Where it goes wrong is oftentimes kind of reflected the incentive structure, right? So what's incentivized? Is winning incentivized to the degree that like we will be bad sports? Is winning incentivized to the degree that we will potentially put our kids in a place where their physical safety is possibly negatively affected, right? There's any number of things that can go sideways if we get the incentive structure wrong. I don't know that, honestly, I have a ton of specific critique for you guys, because what you're doing is very similar to what we're doing. You talk about being a one-stop shop. You talk about things like, develop your own in-house certification so that everybody speaks the same language. And I would hope that like the parents and players that are in your organization understand how unique that is and how powerful it is. Because if you get outside, you get into another area of the pond, you start to see the other side of it. You start to see things where it's like the 12U coach and the 14U coach don't get along, and they don't speak the same language. I know that that's a thing in youth baseball. Unfortunately, it also is a thing in professional baseball. When you start talking about like, your AA hitting coach not communicating with your major league hitting coach, or even your AAA hitting coach, your AZL guy doesn't have the same philosophy as your short season, your extended, like that type of communication problem is very much prevalent in sports broadly, in baseball specifically, because we have organizations that don't do the things like you guys are doing, where you're actually setting that floor of language and expectation. I think there's some things that like, I would tell you that like what we're doing on the academy side of things, to really continue to try to disrupt and push a different signal. And it's things like when we're playing, we're going to be playing in tournaments where, they're USSSA tournaments. USSSA tournaments are generally run on an innings basis as opposed to pitch count. We have it in our constitution that is publicly up at drivelinebaseball.com/Driveline Academy. You can read our constitution. I will put up our operating manual shortly. Our operating manual says that we will pull an entire team out of a tournament before I put a kid in a position where they have exceeded where they should be in terms of workload. We're running a little bit larger rosters in terms of like 13, 14 players where we want to be, so that we mitigate the possibility of that happening. I also mitigate the possibility of that happening by, I don't want 4 pitchers and 8 position players. I want 13 or 14 pitchers. I want to distribute that workload. We're going to be doing things like using things like the Motus sleeve, and tracking velocity as a way to measure output. So we get a little bit more full picture of how the player is performing, and a little bit of a less binary picture, which is like, are they under or over their pitch count? That's a very binary measure of an athlete's readiness. We track things like bat speed to kind of achieve the same thing in terms of the rotational demand of swinging a bat. But yeah, man, I think, we as a facility, much like you guys, you want the best for your kids. Like, that's what we're in this for. And the truth of the matter is that your capacity to actually drive that change is aided greatly when you have them for 20 weeks. That's just the truth of the matter, is that it's like, in drag racing, there's this thing where it's like, you run what you brung. Like, I just show up at the track on a Friday night, we're going to get on the green light, and I'm just going to go. Baseball shouldn't be a run what you brung race. I want these kids to go through that cycle where it's like, we can use gamification to drive positive adaptation over time, and then we're going to deploy it in games. But like that orientation for me is very much probably like an 80-20, 75-25 in terms of time spent developing fundamental athletic capacity, and then 25% of applying that in competition. And so the fact that you guys are kind of taking that holistic approach to it, specifically about giving kids the ability to kind of engage with that over a longer period of time, where we really have an opportunity to get kids good, that's what we do. So I'm kind of unable to offer any specific critique, because that's literally, I think that's our playbook. It's just positive adaptation takes place over time. And, we talked a little bit about like kids getting domed up about the way that their mechanics are of hitting or pitching. And, I will be the first one to tell you, and I'll stand up and take bullets for this until the day I die. Most of these kids, if you just kind of give them the space and an environment to move in, are way more athletic than they are allowed to be, because it gets coached out of them. We are able to kind of highlight that adaptation over time with things like overload and underload training. Like the Russians and the Germans figured out the power of this stuff like 50 or 60 years ago. It works. We try to solve movement from kind of both ends of the spectrum. We use underload implements to try to drive the supramaximal, to try to drive how fast we can move. We use an overload implement to try to drive movement efficiency. We do both of those things at the same time. We get good movement, period. And the best way that you can get that output is taking that holistic one-stop shop approach, of touching all of these things, the specific stuff and then the broad stuff. I would just, again, I don't really have a lot of critique other than to just say that, like, your parents and your kids that are in your program hopefully understand how unique that is, and how valuable it is, because there are a lot of other organizations where, between things like terminology and perspective and desired outcomes and coaching philosophy, man, there's a lot of cooks in a very small kitchen. And when you start talking about not only the best way that we can get a kid good now, but the way that you can get them good over the course of like 4, 6, 8 years, it's time. And if you have all your instructors on the same page about language, about intention, about the way that they treat and respect and honor the customer, which is a 9 to 13 or 15 or 17-year-old boy or girl, when you get that type of situation where everybody's on the same page, it is so hugely valuable. Because you're just limiting all these other potentially negative outcomes that will directly affect the athletic lives and the futures of these kids. So that's my critique, is that, like, keep doing it.
No, I appreciate you not just saying, hey, I've got nothing to say, and saying those things, because like you said, we do a lot of those things, but as you know, when you're trying to tackle all of it, there's so many things that get left behind. There's so many things that you just kind of dabble in, and we critique ourselves all the time and saying we've got to be better in this area. We've got to be better at educating our parents or our players, or this thing we're doing for 4 weeks and maybe we want to do it for 6 more weeks. So hearing you reiterate some of those things that are important just continues to light a fire under us, because there's just a lot to do. And we want to be able to do it at the best possible for the kids and for our coaches and everyone. So it's encouraging to hear to keep at it, because we've got a long ways to go, forever and ever, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that's all of us, right? It's like the coach's lament is like, I look at the stuff that I said to my kids literally like 2 years ago, and like, that was dumb. That was so stupid. I'm constantly thinking about like how to do this thing better. And I think that is just, at Driveline, it's very kind of, it's the core of what we do. It's test, retest. It's like, we did a thing, we measure it, we measure the outcome, we're going to train, and then we retest. And like, did we get better? Did we get worse? What did we get better in? That fundamental thing of test and retest is just everything. So, being able to kind of do that, have that approach, for your organization, and constantly looking to improve this stuff, it's really special and it's unique, and more people need to get that signal. Absolutely, because again, that's the stuff that makes the biggest difference to these kids.
Well, I appreciate you saying all that. Obviously, We like to hear that, but what we're doing is the right thing from some of the experts in the industry. But also, being able to do a show like this and share it with our families, it's kind of a different voice. So I appreciate you voicing that.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
So with that said, we'll kind of end it off here, but I want you to be able to tell everyone whether it's about the academy, the certification. I only bring on people that I either know or like or trust, or all three. I love the stuff that you're doing. I love, if people aren't following you on social media, especially Twitter, you do a fantastic job of being a voice for youth baseball, from wearing a bunch of different hats. So where can people follow you? Where can they learn about your programs?
Sure. So I am very active, for better or worse, on Twitter. It's Deven Morgan, DEVEN, I was lucky enough that somebody else didn't have my name, so I was able to get that. For us right now, my number one focus is Driveline Academy, just because I think, again, that like the great thing about the position that Driveline is in is I can say we do work with like very high level athletes. I'm a crazy Dodger fan, so like Clayton Kershaw's in our building, Joe Kelly's in our building, Kenley Jansen is in our building, Alex Wood does our stuff. Like that's great. What I try to say with people in terms of how that relates to the academy is we're able to take the information that we glean from those processes and what's applicable to the highest level of performance, and then make that fit for what works for youth athletes. And I think there is a little bit of, hopefully, power in that, where it's like, I know that like going to spring training this year and watching the Dodgers spring training, a lot of that stuff that takes place on the backfields is like, that's the dregs of spring. It's like, you're doing your, 120 minutes of PFPs and first and thirds and stuff. And when you're playing for a job, when you're playing for a paycheck and a livelihood, you got to do that stuff, because that's the consequences at stake. What I hope that people are able to appreciate, and I think what's kind of what I need to do a good job of communicating, is understand that, like, yes, we're Driveline and we work with basically all of Major League Baseball, international baseball. We're all over the place. We work with the best of the best. That doesn't mean that the training environments that we create for young athletes model the same degree of consequence, because it can't, because they're kids. So my hope is that somebody's able to, if they come to us and they're like, oh, well, Driveline works with these high level guys, I assume that like their training for youth athletes is like grueling and monotonous and it's very serious. And then you see us in our facility playing home run derby. You see us in our facility playing, we'll do a bullpen game called Can't Get Hurt There. The idea being that it's like, I want to practice having you throw that down and away pitch, because you can't get hurt there, right? But like, we're going to do it in a gamified sense, and we're going to respect the fact that kids are kids and they're not small adults, and we're going to orient towards the A-level problems that is relative to their level of competition, which is not, I need to win this game so I can get a paycheck. I need to win this game so I can get a paycheck to pay my mortgage. It's, you're a kid, and our number one thing is it has to stay fun. Beyond that, yes, we focus on skills at scale. We are very big on kind of that qualitative feedback loop of making sure that kids are informed of how they perform, and that they see their development in a way that they can't deny it. Because I know how impactful that feedback loop is and how incentivizing it can be. So that's, the number one thing that I want people to understand is that it's like, yes, we do a lot of high level baseball work, player training, equipment, enterprise level software stuff. Like, we do all that stuff. But I want people to see the way that we approach youth baseball in a way that is representative of the fact that the number one thing that these kids need is to continue to love the game. We need to continue to foster whatever that impulse was the first time that kid saw a ball player and was like, that's what I want to do. If I'm not putting gasoline on that fire in some way, shape, or form, I'm not doing right by that kid, and I'm not honoring that kid and their desires and their dreams. And the stake that I have in the game is that I'm literally building this thing with my two kids in mind, because I have a 13-year-old girl who's decided that like she's going to be the first player in MLB. I have an 11-year-old son that has this crazy idea that he's also going to play professional baseball. And so it's like that's my why. You know, every day that I wake up and I spend all day long working on youth baseball stuff, it's because I want to honor my kids' desires and every other kid like them. Because, you know, my wife and I are not blessed in the sense that like we're going to create the next Aaron Judge. You know, we don't make people like that. We make like sub 6 foot people with like a little bit of muscle on their frame and good hips. Those are the people that we make. But this is baseball. And the great thing about baseball is that I really feel like it's not necessarily about the genetic stuff. I mean, obviously that helps. It does help. But when it comes to youth baseball, my kids feel like they can go out and compete with anybody. And I want every kid as possible that we can inspire to feel capable and comfortable in going out and having that same type of confidence. So that's why we made Driveline Academy. And it's also where we're working on other initiatives to scale that because, you know, youth baseball development is great. You know, we got 600 or so of those certifications out there. You know, that's 7,200 kids in the country that are affected. I want to turn that number to 72,000. You know, I want to turn this model for what we're trying to do for Driveline Academy from being in Seattle to being into other communities that are underserved and don't have access to the same resources we do. Because again, I'm very much a belief that especially in today's kind of socioeconomic climate, that we can use this game as a conduit for bringing people together. And I know that sounds stupid and corny and trite, but like the fact of the matter is that it's my life experience. You know, it's my life experience and it's my adult experience of seeing people of different backgrounds culturally come into our gym and Driveline and be brothers and be a part of this brotherhood, be a part of this environment. So, you know, we're starting that with Driveline Academy, you know, here in Washington, but I'm actively working on bringing it outside of there because for me, it's just not good enough to do a good job by 150 kids. That's not enough. It's not enough to do 7,200 kids with youth baseball development certification. That's not enough because there's a lot of other kids who, again, they come back to that same impetus, which is like, man, I have so much fun playing baseball. And all I want to do is help that kid orient towards the skills at scale so that if we can keep them in the game, they have a set of skills that make that transition and that growth more viable.
I love your passion about that. I can't wait to see what it looks like in 5 and 10 years. I know I put it in kind of our social media and we talked about it on here before. I just really think this was a great episode for people to be able to connect with you as a parent, as a coach, as an employee at a big facility. Like, I just think there's so many connection points. So I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate your vulnerability with just throwing it all out there. And I think this is awesome. I'll have you stick around afterward for a few minutes so we can kind of converse for a sec. But I think this is a great place to end, and I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, man.